The flight was one of those long journeys that made people either excited or restless. Sandra Bullock, dressed simply in comfortable travel clothes, walked through the jet bridge with her boarding pass in hand. She carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't demand attention, but always drew eyes anyway. Even without makeup and without a team around her, there was something about her presence that made people notice. She reached her seat in first class, tucked near the window. It wasn't her first time flying in such comfort, but for her it was never about luxury. She had been working non-stop for weeks, shooting late nights and juggling commitments, and now all she wanted was a few hours of peace. A soft seat, some quiet air, and maybe a nap before her next schedule. The glamorous world outside always seemed far away once she was inside a plane. Here she was just another passenger with a ticket and a destination. Sandra placed her small carry-on bag in the overhead bin, careful not to disturb anyone else. She gave a polite smile to the flight attendant who offered to help, and then slid into her seat, pulling out a book she had brought along. There was comfort in simple things, reading quietly, sipping tea, and watching the clouds drift outside the window around her. First class was buzzing with a mix of travelers. Some wore sharp suits, scrolling through emails and preparing for meetings. Others looked like vacationers, already sinking into their seats with headphones and wine glasses. Sandra noticed everything in that subtle way she always did. The little habits of people in shared spaces. She had always been good at blending in, making herself part of the background rather than the spotlight, especially when she wasn't on a movie set yet. As much as she wanted to disappear into her own world, there was always the quiet hum of recognition. A couple of passengers had already glanced at her with that look, the one that says, "Is that who I think it is?" She smiled politely, giving nothing more away. Sandra had learned long ago how to carry herself so people felt at ease. She didn't want anyone to feel like she was untouchable, but she also valued her boundaries. As the boarding continued, Sandra leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her family, her friends, and how rare it was to have time to just sit without cameras or scripts. Flying had always been a strange experience for her, both freeing and vulnerable. Freeing because up in the sky, nobody could expect too much of her. Vulnerable because strangers could still decide who they thought she was. Some saw the actress, some saw the celebrity, but very few saw the woman simply trying to find a little rest. The cabin crew began their routine, offering champagne to those settling in. Sandra declined gently, asking only for water. She never liked the idea of starting a long flight with alcohol. She preferred clarity. She pulled the blanket across her lap and flipped through her book, but her mind wandered. It was hard not to think about the pace of her life, the constant interviews, the way people always seemed to expect her to be funny, charming, or perfect. But on a flight like this, surrounded by strangers in a sealed world above the clouds, she could just be. For a little while, the atmosphere in first class felt peaceful. Bags were stored, seatbelts clicked, the soft murmur of conversation filled the air. Sandra allowed herself to relax into the rhythm, watching people shuffle about, watching the flight attendants work with that steady, trained grace. There was something almost magical about these moments before takeoff. Everyone, no matter how important they thought they were, had to sit down and fasten their seatbelts. Everyone was equal in that brief pause between earth and sky. Sandra loved that. She loved seeing powerful people reduced to passengers, all waiting for the same thing. The moment the plane lifted into the air, Sandra thought about how much she enjoyed people watching. She noticed the nervous man checking his watch every 2 minutes, maybe afraid of missing a connection. She noticed the young woman in the corner typing quickly on her laptop, trying to finish something before the Wi-Fi cut off. These were small, ordinary details, but they grounded her, reminding her of real life beyond the red carpets and film premieres. As the announcement came over the speakers, asking passengers to prepare for takeoff, Sandra leaned her head against the seat and exhaled softly. She felt grateful for the chance to pause, to be invisible, or at least as invisible as she could be. In a world that always seemed to have eyes on her, she had no idea in that calm moment that this flight would become one of those unforgettable experiences people talk about for years. No idea that someone's loud voice would soon cut through the peace she was craving. No idea that another familiar face, someone who had stood beside her on movie sets and who knew her better than most, would step forward in a way that would surprise everyone on board. For now, Sandra was simply a woman on a plane, quietly preparing herself for the hours ahead, hoping for silence, hoping for rest. not knowing that the journey was about to give her a story that would travel far beyond the cabin walls. The peaceful silence of the cabin did not last long. Just as the final boarding announcements ended and the plane's doors were closed, a man seated 2 rows ahead of Sandra began to make himself very noticeable. He was dressed in a crisp business suit, with shiny shoes and an expensive watch that he kept adjusting as if he wanted everyone to see it. His posture was loud even when he wasn't speaking, the kind of posture that said, "I am important here." At first, his voice carried in a casual way, chatting with the passenger next to him about deals, investments, and meetings. He spoke with the kind of confidence that demanded attention. But it wasn't the content of his words, it was the tone. It was sharp, loud enough for more than just his seatmate to hear, and it was clear he liked the idea of an audience. Within minutes, the man shifted from bragging to criticizing. He made comments about the airline's service, rolling his eyes when a flight attendant politely offered him a drink. He waved her off dismissively and muttered something about how first class wasn't what it used to be. A few passengers looked away, trying to avoid confrontation, while others shared subtle glances. Recognizing the energy of someone who thrived on belittling others, Sandra tried to stay focused on her book, but the man's voice carried over. His words seemed to grow sharper as he searched for a target. He spoke about famous people he had met, casually dropping names as if they were trophies. Then, almost deliberately, he turned his attention toward Sandra. His eyes flicked in her direction and his lips curved into a smirk. "Oh, look," he said in a voice that was both mocking and playful. "We have a movie star among us, imagine that. First-class seats still being wasted on people who play pretend for a living." His words cut through the air, louder than necessary, loud enough for everyone around to hear. Sandra kept her calm. She had faced worse comments before, both in interviews and in public. Still, there was a sting in the way he said it. Not because his words held truth, but because they dripped with the intention to humiliate. He wasn't teasing, he was belittling. His goal was not conversation, but control. The man chuckled at his own remark, as if expecting others to join in. A few people looked down, avoiding eye contact, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. The atmosphere shifted slightly, from calm to tense like a thread pulled too tight. Everyone could feel it, but no one wanted to be the first to react. Sandra adjusted her seatbelt and kept her eyes on her book, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. That quiet strength, the refusal to engage, was something she had practiced many times. Yet her silence only seemed to encourage him. He leaned back in his chair, speaking louder now. "Actors, singers, these so-called stars, they get lucky once. And suddenly they think they're better than everyone else. Real work takes brains, not just smiling at cameras." He didn't mention Sandra's name directly this time, but his eyes flicked toward her again, making the target of his words obvious. The passenger sitting across from Sandra shifted uncomfortably, almost as if wanting to speak up, but he looked away quickly. Other passengers whispered quietly, not loud enough to stop the man, but loud enough to show they disapproved. Still no one intervened. It was the kind of social silence that happens when people witness rudeness, but are afraid of making it worse. Sandra turned a page in her book slowly. Her heartbeat was steady, though part of her wished the man would simply lose interest. She knew engaging would only feed his behavior, but ignoring him carried its own weight. The cabin now seemed smaller, the air thicker. The man wasn't finished. He went on about how people in entertainment were overpaid, how society had become obsessed with celebrities. His voice dripped with sarcasm. He didn't care that his words made others uncomfortable. If anything, he seemed to enjoy the tension. For him, this was a performance, one he believed he was winning. For a brief moment, Sandra wondered if she should quietly move seats, but she decided against it. Running from such moments wasn't her way. Besides, she had paid for her place like everyone else. She wasn't about to let anyone push her into hiding. As the plane taxied onto the runway, the man continued his one-man show. His remarks rolled off his tongue with practiced cruelty, and though Sandra kept her grace intact, there was no denying the weight of his presence on the cabin. He had managed to shift the energy of an entire section of the plane with nothing more than arrogance and volume. Nobody yet realized that this unpleasant performance was setting the stage for something far more memorable. The rude words, the dismissive tone, and the attempt to belittle would soon meet an unexpected counter. A counter so calm and graceful that it would leave the entire cabin silent, waiting and then applauding inside their hearts. For now, though, the disruption had begun. The once peaceful hum of the cabin was broken, and Sandra Bullock found herself the unwilling focus of a man's need to feel superior. She didn't respond. She didn't fight back. She simply sat with quiet dignity, trusting that the truth of her character spoke louder than his insults ever could. Sandra sat quietly, pretending to focus on her book. Though her eyes were no longer moving across the words, she could still hear the man's sharp voice echoing in her ears. His comments weren't new. She had dealt with criticism and insults before, but the way he said them, with arrogance and delight, made it clear he was trying to hurt. Yet Sandra did not respond. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the strongest answer. If she argued, she would only give him fuel. If she snapped, he would smile with victory. So she chose to remain calm, her face composed, her breathing steady on the outside. She looked unbothered, but on the inside she felt the weight of every word. Sandra reminded herself of the countless times in her career when she had been underestimated, when people had said she was only good for romantic comedies, when critics doubted she could handle serious roles, when strangers assumed her success came from luck rather than talent and hard work. She had heard it all, and each time she had proven them wrong. This man on the plane was just another voice in a long history of voices that tried to define her worth. She adjusted her scarf, glanced briefly at the clouds outside the window, and returned her eyes to the book in her hands. Her posture was steady, her chin slightly lifted. She wasn't going to hide or shrink, not even for a second. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was control. She was choosing her reaction carefully. The passengers around her noticed. Some admired her calm, whispering quietly to each other. They saw the way she handled herself, refusing to be dragged into an argument. For some, it was inspiring. A woman sitting in the middle of public humiliation yet holding her ground with grace. For others, it was uncomfortable. They wanted to help but didn't know how. They were afraid to speak up, so they let Sandra's quiet dignity do the talking. The man, however, wasn't satisfied. He looked over at her again, his smirk growing as if he thought her silence meant defeat. He didn't realize that his words said more about him than about her. To him, silence meant weakness. But to Sandra, silence was strength inside. Sandra reminded herself of the people who truly mattered. Her family, her friends, her colleagues who respected her. She thought of the young actors she had mentored, the charity work she had done quietly behind the cameras, the late nights of hard work no one ever saw. Those were the things that defined her, not the cruel words of a stranger on a plane. She thought about her mother, who had always told her, "You don't have to answer every insult. Sometimes your silence is the only answer they deserve." That wisdom had guided Sandra through Hollywood, through fame, and through the many storms that came with it. And now here she was, using it again, thousands of feet above the ground. In a cabin full of strangers, the man's voice carried on. But Sandra's refusal to engage slowly created an invisible wall. His words hit the air and fell flat. His attempts to provoke her had no fire because she refused to light the match. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't frown, she didn't even sigh. She just sat there calm and unshaken. And that frustrated him more than anything. At one point, a flight attendant walked by and offered Sandra a refill of water. Sandra thanked her kindly, her voice gentle and polite. That small interaction showed everyone around that she wasn't broken. She wasn't upset. She was in control. Her kindness in that simple "thank you" spoke louder than any defense she could have given to the man. The passengers watching silently admired her more and more. It wasn't just about being a famous actress now. It was about being human, being strong without needing to fight back. Her calmness made others see the truth clearly. The rude man wasn't powerful. He was simply loud. And Sandra, without saying a word, revealed that truth. As the plane began to climb into the sky, Sandra closed her book and leaned back slightly. Letting her eyes rest, she wasn't pretending anymore. She was genuinely at peace, even in the middle of the storm. She had chosen not to carry his words into her heart, and that choice gave her freedom. The man, though, continued to shift in his seat, growing restless. His laughter had lost its confidence. His tone had lost its charm. He looked around, but no one was meeting his eyes anymore. The energy in the cabin was no longer on his side. Sandra's silence had turned the tide, and he didn't even realize it fully. What he didn't know was that his performance was about to end. Because silence had power, yes, but sometimes silence also called for an answer. And the answer was coming, not from Sandra, but from someone else on the plane. Someone who had seen enough. Someone who knew Sandra not just as an actress but as a friend. And that answer would arrive with calmness, respect, and strength so undeniable that the entire cabin would fall silent. For now, Sandra sat in her seat, the picture of composure, teaching everyone in the cabin a lesson without ever speaking a word. She was calm in the storm, strong in her quiet, and dignified in the face of cruelty. The tension inside the cabin was growing heavier. Passengers who had started the journey with small smiles and polite chatter now avoided eye contact with one another. It was as if everyone felt the sharp edge of the man's voice, but no one wanted to be the one to break the silence. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending to focus on magazines, movies, or the view outside the window, but their attention always drifted back to the loud passenger and the quiet woman he was trying to belittle. The man leaned back in his seat with the smugness of someone who believed he was the most important person on the plane. Every word he spoke seemed meant for the entire cabin rather than the person beside him. His tone carried the arrogance of entitlement, and with every sentence he tried to prove his dominance. One passenger sitting diagonally from Sandra clenched his jaw. Clearly annoyed, he glanced at her as if silently asking if she was all right. But Sandra simply gave a small, calm smile. She didn't need saving. She didn't want a scene, and yet, her silence somehow made the entire cabin even more aware of the cruelty happening. The flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, pretending not to hear the man's remarks. Their training told them not to escalate conflicts unless absolutely necessary. Still, one could see the stiffness in their posture, the way their polite smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. They too could feel the discomfort spreading like a fog through the cabin. The air had changed, the hum of the engines, the clinking of glasses. Even the soft whispers between travelers seemed muted. What stood out most was the imbalance. On one side of the cabin sat a man puffed up with arrogance, tossing out words like stones, and on the other sat Sandra Bullock, quiet, dignified, refusing to stoop to his level. Passengers began exchanging glances. The couple in the front row shifted closer together, whispering about how rude the man was. A young traveler further back pulled out his phone, not to record but to distract himself from the growing tension. People were restless, but no one dared to interfere. It was the kind of silence where everyone hoped someone else would step up. Sandra remained composed, her book still open on her lap, though her eyes were far from the page. Her presence was steady, and that steadiness became almost magnetic. The more she remained calm, the more others noticed how wrong the man's behavior was. She didn't argue, she didn't fight back, and that made his insults echo even louder in the uncomfortable quiet of the cabin. The man laughed at his own words, clearly expecting the cabin to join him. But the laughter never came. Instead, there was only the sound of shifting seats and the occasional cough. The absence of approval slowly revealed itself as disapproval, though no one said it out loud. One elderly woman sitting across from Sandra gave her a soft, sympathetic nod as if to say, "You're handling this well, we see you." Sandra returned the nod with a gentle smile. It was a small exchange, but it spoke volumes. It showed that while most passengers were silent, they weren't blind. They recognized the strength in her composure. Still, the tension was undeniable. Every time the man opened his mouth, the cabin seemed to tighten, like a string pulled too hard. Everyone knew it couldn't go on forever. Something had to shift. Either the man would run out of things to say, or someone would finally confront him. Until then, the passengers sat in uneasy patience, waiting for the balance to return. Sandra thought about how strange human behavior could be. A single voice, negative and loud, had the power to control the mood of an entire room, or in this case, an entire cabin. Dozens of people, all strangers, shared the same discomfort, and yet none of them spoke up. She understood it, though. She knew people feared confrontation, especially with someone who seemed so sure of himself. The engines roared as the plane leveled into the sky, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained heavy. Sandra adjusted her seat and exhaled softly, reminding herself that this moment too would pass. She had been through worse storms in her life, and she knew that grace often spoke louder than anger. But the passengers continued to watch. Some of them secretly wished Sandra would snap back. They wanted her to unleash the kind of wit and strength they had seen in her films. But she didn't. She wasn't playing a character. She was being herself, and herself was calm, grounded, unwilling to give power to cruelty. The man, however, mistook her silence for weakness. He chuckled again and leaned closer toward his seatmate, making sure his voice still carried. See, she can't even defend herself, he said. His tone was dripping with mockery. But what he didn't realize was that the cabin had already judged him. They didn't see a strong man humiliating someone. They saw a small man trying too hard to be important. And though no one spoke yet, the silence in the cabin had shifted. It wasn't silence born of fear anymore, it was silence charged with anticipation. People sensed that something was about to happen. Something that would break this uncomfortable tension. They didn't know who would do it, but they knew the moment was coming. Sandra remained where she was, unshaken. Her grace was teaching the entire cabin a lesson in patience and dignity. But somewhere, just a few rows away, another passenger was watching too. Someone who had known Sandra for years. Someone who couldn't sit by much longer. That someone was preparing to stand up, not with anger, but with respect. And that single action would soon change the entire mood of the flight. Keanu Reeves had been sitting quietly a few rows ahead. He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself, in fact. Most passengers didn't even notice he was on board. Unlike many celebrities, Keanu had mastered the art of blending in, wearing plain clothes, keeping his head down, and moving with a humility that made him almost invisible. But Keanu was listening. His sharp instincts picked up on the change in energy behind him. At first he tried to ignore it, giving the man the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was just nerves before a flight. Maybe the man had too much to drink, but as the minutes passed, it became clear this wasn't just casual chatter. The man's voice was growing louder, his words sharper, and Keanu realized that Sandra was the target. Keanu knew Sandra well. They had worked together, laughed together, and supported each other through the highs and lows of Hollywood. He respected her deeply, not only for her talent but for her kindness. He knew her strength. And he also knew her silence wasn't weakness. It was her way of rising above. But Keanu also knew the weight of being attacked unfairly in public. He could feel the discomfort of the entire cabin pressing in. When Keanu got up to stretch his legs and walk toward the back of the cabin, he caught a glimpse of Sandra. She sat with calm dignity, her book in her lap, her expression steady. She wasn't crumbling, she wasn't fighting. She was simply enduring. But Keanu felt something stir inside him, a quiet but powerful urge to act. On his way back from speaking briefly with a flight attendant, Keanu passed by the row where Sandra was seated. The rude man was still talking, his smug grin widening each time his words hung in the air unanswered. Passengers nearby had grown restless, fidgeting in their seats, looking everywhere but at him. Keanu paused for a moment, standing in the aisle. His presence wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful, but it immediately drew attention. Passengers noticed him, some whispering in surprise, others sitting straighter in their seats. His calm energy was like a ripple spreading through the cabin. Sandra looked up and met his eyes for a brief second. Her face softened into a small smile. It was a look of recognition, of quiet gratitude. Keanu didn't need her to say anything, he already knew. He gave her a nod, a silent promise that she wasn't alone. The rude man noticed too. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Suddenly less certain of his dominance, he recognized Keanu. Of course he did. Almost everyone did, but Keanu didn't look at him. He didn't waste energy on the arrogance. Instead, he walked directly to Sandra. He leaned down slightly, his voice calm but loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Sandra," he said warmly, his tone filled with familiarity and respect. "It's so good to see you. How have you been?" Sandra smiled, her composure never breaking. "I've been well," she replied softly. "It's nice to see you too." The cabin seemed to pause. Everyone's eyes were now on the two of them, not because they were celebrities, but because of the warmth that filled the space between them. Keanu didn't stop there. He continued speaking with sincerity. "You know, I've always admired how hard you work. I don't think people realize the dedication and effort you put into everything you do. You've always been one of the most professional, kind, and inspiring people I've met." His words carried weight, not because of who he was, but because of how he said them, with honesty, with calmness, with no need to exaggerate. The cabin grew silent. The kind of silence that came not from tension but from respect. The rude man shifted again, his smirk faltering. His performance had ended without anyone directly confronting him. Keanu hadn't shouted, hadn't argued, he had simply replaced cruelty with truth. Arrogance with respect, the contrast was undeniable. Sandra felt a warmth in her chest, not just from the kindness of Keanu's words, but from the way he chose to handle the moment. He hadn't fought fire with fire. He hadn't humiliated the man the way he had tried to humiliate her. Instead, he had elevated the atmosphere with grace. Passengers began exchanging smiles. A woman whispered to her husband, "That's how you do it." Another nodded in agreement. The air that had felt so heavy minutes before now seemed lighter, as if everyone could breathe again. Sandra thanked Keanu quietly, her eyes shining with appreciation. He simply nodded again, a small smile tugging at his lips. For him, it wasn't about making a scene. It was about restoring balance, about reminding everyone of the power of kindness and respect. Keanu then stepped back toward his seat, leaving behind a silence that wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the kind of silence that comes after something meaningful has been said. A silence filled with reflection, admiration, and even a little awe. The rude man didn't say another word. He looked down at his hands, suddenly very interested in the screen in front of him. The arrogance had drained from his posture, replaced by a quiet stillness. No one needed to tell him he had lost the room. He could feel it. He had tried to belittle, but instead, he had been outshone by dignity. Sandra leaned back in her seat. More at peace now, the storm had passed, and she hadn't needed to raise her voice. Keanu's presence had been enough. His calm defense, his unexpected but graceful move, had silenced the entire cabin, and in that moment, Sandra knew this flight would be remembered not for the insults of a stranger, but for the quiet strength of friendship and respect. The cabin had fallen into a silence so complete that even the steady hum of the engine seemed louder. All eyes had shifted from the arrogant man to Keanu and Sandra. The energy that had once been heavy with discomfort was now filled with something very different. Respect, admiration, and even relief. It was as if the entire room had taken a deep breath together, realizing the moment had changed. Keanu had not raised his voice. He had not argued. He had not humiliated anyone. Instead, he had spoken with warmth and honesty. His words about Sandra's work ethic and kindness had landed with the weight of truth. They echoed louder than any insult the rude passenger had thrown earlier. The contrast between cruelty and kindness was clear to everyone. Sandra felt a quiet strength return to her chest. She had been calm all along, but hearing Keanu's words spoken so publicly, so sincerely, was like a shield placed gently over her. She didn't need defending. She had chosen her silence with purpose. But Keanu's gesture made the moment more than just endurance. It became a reminder that respect could always drown out arrogance. The rude passenger shifted in his seat. His earlier smirk was gone. His voice, which had filled the cabin for nearly half an hour, had vanished completely. He stared down at his hands, then at the screen in front of him, as if the brightness there could distract him from the embarrassment now pressing in. He could feel the eyes of the cabin on him, not with admiration, not with agreement, but with quiet disapproval. The passengers who had been silent began to soften. A woman in the second row smiled at Sandra. A man in a business suit gave a small nod toward Keanu. Another leaned closer to his travel partner and whispered, "That was perfect." The sense of unease was lifting, and in its place was unity. People no longer felt divided by silence. They felt connected by the truth they had just witnessed. Sandra looked up at Keanu, her eyes calm but warm. Her smile was small, private, but filled with gratitude. Keanu didn't linger on the attention. He wasn't interested in applause or acknowledgement. He simply returned the smile and walked back toward his seat, blending once more into the background the way he always preferred. His actions had spoken enough. The man who had caused the disturbance opened his mouth once, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. The weight of the silence was too much. It wasn't Sandra or Keanu who silenced him. It was the entire cabin. He realized that his audience, the group he had been performing for, had slipped away from him. They were no longer entertained. They were united against his cruelty. Sandra settled back into her seat, closing her book gently. She didn't need to prove herself. She didn't need to say a single word. Keanu's unexpected move had done what needed to be done, not by attacking the man, but by lifting her up, by reminding everyone of who she really was. The flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles again, their smiles a little brighter now. One of them paused near Sandra and asked softly if she needed anything. Her tone was filled with respect. Sandra shook her head politely. "No, thank you," she said with a gentle smile. The kindness in her voice seemed to spread, easing whatever tension had been left in the air. For the rest of the cabin, the moment became a lesson. People thought about how easy it was for negativity to take over a space. how quickly one voice could change the mood of dozens, but they also realized how powerful a calm, respectful action could be. Keanu hadn't shouted down the rude passenger. He had simply shifted the attention to truth. His move reminded everyone that dignity had more power than arrogance. Some passengers would later tell the story to friends, not just because two famous actors were involved, but because of the way the moment unfolded. They would say, it wasn't about celebrity. It was about respect. They would describe how one person's cruelty filled the cabin, and how another person's kindness cleared the air. Sandra, meanwhile, allowed herself a quiet breath of relief. She wasn't angry, she wasn't bitter. She simply felt thankful for the silence she had chosen, for the strength she carried, and for the friend who had stepped in at just the right time. She leaned back in her seat, gazing at the clouds outside. Feeling lighter, the sky seemed calmer now. Or maybe it was just her heart. The rude man never regained his voice. He didn't dare speak again about luck or celebrities or the worth of others. He sat in his seat, quiet, invisible, his earlier performance forgotten. He had been silenced not by force but by respect. And that silence was far more powerful than any argument could have been. As the hours of the flight continued, the cabin returned to normal. People resumed their conversations. Laughter returned in soft ripples. Glasses clinked again. But beneath the normal rhythm was a shared memory. Everyone had witnessed the same thing. Everyone had felt the same shift. It was a story that would travel beyond the cabin walls. Sandra picked up her book once more, but this time, her smile lingered. She wasn't smiling at the pages. She was smiling at the reminder that kindness could still surprise her, even in the most unexpected places. And Keanu, sitting quietly in his seat, didn't need to say another word. His gesture had been simple, but it was enough to silence the cabin, to protect a friend, and to remind every soul on board that dignity, respect, and grace would always rise above cruelty. The cabin was wrapped in a silence that felt different now. It was no longer the heavy silence of discomfort. It was the kind of silence that followed something meaningful. The kind where people didn't want to break the moment too quickly. Everyone seemed to be holding on to it, letting it settle inside them. Keanu had returned to his seat, blending back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. But the memory of his words lingered in the air. They echoed not just for Sandra but for everyone who had witnessed them. His tone, his choice of kindness, his refusal to fight anger with anger. These things carried more power than any loud argument ever could. Sandra sat still, her hands resting calmly on her book. Her lips curved into a soft smile. It wasn't the smile of someone who wanted to win or prove a point. It was the smile of someone who understood the power of grace. She didn't look at the rude man anymore. She didn't need to. His silence was proof enough. He had been disarmed without a single insult thrown his way. The passengers slowly began to exchange glances. First a few, then many, their eyes met in unspoken agreement. They all knew they had witnessed something rare. A young woman in the aisle seat leaned toward her friend and whispered, "That was amazing." The friend nodded, her eyes wide. "I've never seen anything like it." A businessman near the front cleared his throat softly and gave Sandra a respectful nod when she glanced up. His gesture was small but meaningful. It said, "We're with you." The elderly woman from earlier placed her hand gently over her heart, her eyes shining with quiet admiration. She didn't need to say a word. Her expression spoke for her. The rude man, however, sat frozen in his seat. His posture had collapsed, his shoulders hunched. His earlier confidence had vanished. He avoided looking at anyone. His hands fidgeted nervously with the hem of his sleeve. He seemed smaller now, as though the weight of the silence pressed down on him. He had wanted attention, and he had gotten it, but not in the way he hoped. It was fascinating how quickly the energy of the cabin had shifted. Just moments earlier, people had been tense, restless, afraid to speak. Now they were united in a quiet admiration. The atmosphere was lighter, warmer. The uncomfortable tension had been replaced by a shared respect. Sandra leaned her head gently against the seat, her smile still lingering. She thought about how strange life could be. A simple flight, a stranger's arrogance, and then a friend's unexpected kindness had turned into a moment she would never forget. She didn't feel bitterness toward the man. Instead, she felt grateful for the reminder of how respect could silence cruelty. The passengers settled back into their routines, but their movements were softer, more thoughtful. They no longer glanced nervously toward the rude man. Instead, Their eyes drifted toward Sandra with quiet admiration. They weren't seeing the actress anymore. They were seeing the woman, strong, calm, dignified. And they were seeing the bond of friendship that had protected her in the most graceful way. Keanu remained quiet in his seat, reading a magazine as if nothing had happened. That was the most striking part of it. He hadn't done it for attention. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because it was right. And that quiet authenticity made the moment even more powerful. The rude man tried once or twice to shift in his seat to look busy, but every time he glanced up, he was met with the unspoken weight of the cabin. Nobody glared at him, nobody said anything, but the silence itself was louder than any scolding. He knew he had lost the room. He knew his words had backfired. Sandra closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to rest. Her heart felt light. She didn't need to replay the man's words in her mind. They were already fading, replaced instead by the warmth of Keanu's gesture. The kindness in his voice had wrapped around her like armor, and she carried that feeling with her as the plane soared higher into the night sky. The passengers, too, carried the moment with them. Each one of them had learned something quietly. They had seen how a single act of respect could change the energy of a whole room. They had seen how cruelty, when met with silence and kindness, had no real power. Some would tell the story later. Not with every detail, but with the lesson it carried. The cabin was now calm, peaceful in a way that hadn't seemed possible just an hour before. The only sound was the soft rustling of pages, the gentle clinking of glasses, and the steady hum of the engines. It was as if the flight itself had exhaled in relief. The rude man remained silent, shrinking deeper into his seat. His arrogance was gone, his presence forgotten. What remained instead was the memory of how quickly his loud voice had been drowned out by something stronger. And so the cabin remained united in quiet respect. They had all seen it, they had all felt it, and they knew they would remember it. Not as a story about rudeness, but as a story about dignity, kindness, and the unexpected move that silenced the entire cabin. Sandra sat quietly in her seat, her body finally beginning to relax. The book rested on her lap, unopened now. Her eyes wandered to the window, where the clouds stretched like an endless blanket below the plane. She thought about how strange and unpredictable life could be. She had boarded this flight hoping only for some peace and rest. Yet she was leaving with a story that would stay with her forever. Her heart was calm. She did not carry anger toward the man who had tried to belittle her. She did not feel bitterness. Instead, she felt grateful. Grateful for her own choice to remain calm. Grateful for the passengers who silently stood with her. And above all, grateful for Keanu, who had stepped in with such grace. His unexpected move had not only silenced the man, but had lifted the entire cabin's spirit. Sandra thought about what true strength really meant. It wasn't about shouting louder. It wasn't about proving yourself in every moment. Sometimes true strength was the ability to stay calm, to rise above, and to let kindness do the talking. That was exactly what had happened here, and she knew the memory of it would guide her in other moments of her life. The cabin around her had returned to its normal rhythm. Passengers were watching movies, flipping through magazines, or quietly chatting again. Yet underneath the surface, something had shifted. They were all still carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. It was no longer a cabin full of strangers. It was a group of people who had shared a powerful moment together. Sandra glanced around and caught the eye of a young woman sitting a few rows across. The woman gave her a shy smile. As if to say, "You inspired me," Sandra returned the smile. Soft and warm, she didn't need words. That brief exchange was enough in that small gesture. She felt the strength of human connection. The man who had caused the disruption remained silent. He had shrunk into himself, avoiding glances, his earlier arrogance gone completely. Sandra didn't feel the need to look at him. He was no longer important. He had been silenced not by anger but by truth. And that truth spoke louder than anything else. Sandra closed her eyes for a while, letting the gentle hum of the engine soothe her. She thought about Keanu, sitting just a few rows ahead. He had acted without hesitation. Not for applause, not for recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That was who he was. That was why people admired him, not just as an actor, but as a man of quiet integrity. She smiled to herself, remembering all the times she and Keanu had crossed paths in their careers. He had always been steady, always humble, always kind, and now, even in something as ordinary as a plane ride, he had shown the same qualities. It reminded her that real friendships were not built in moments of ease but revealed in moments of challenge. As the flight continued, the memory of the incident faded into the background, but the lesson it carried stayed strong. Sandra reflected on how respect could transform a space, how one person's decision to choose kindness could influence dozens of others. The man's cruelty had been loud, but Keanu's kindness had been louder. Passengers would later tell the story in different ways. Some would say, "I was on a flight where Keanu Reeves defended Sandra Bullock." Others would say, "I saw what real dignity looks like." Each version would be a little different, but the heart of the story would remain the same, a reminder that respect, kindness, and calm strength always win. For Sandra, it wasn't just a story for others. It was a personal reminder. She thought about how often people in the public eye were judged, criticized, or mocked. She thought about the many times she had chosen silence, and now she realized that silence, when paired with dignity, had the power to shift an entire room, especially when supported by a friend who understood the value of kindness. As the hours passed and the plane drew closer to its destination, Sandra felt lighter. She no longer thought about the rude words. They had no space left in her mind. Instead, she carried the warmth of Keanu's gesture, the quiet support of the passengers, and the peaceful knowledge that she had handled herself with grace. The landing announcement came over the speakers, and the passengers began preparing. Some stretched their arms, some packed away their belongings. Sandra buckled her seatbelt and glanced out of the window again. The city lights below twinkled like stars. She thought about how this flight, which had started like any other, had given her a story she would always remember. When the plane touched down and rolled to a stop, the passengers gathered their things. Many stole one last glance at Sandra, not with the gaze of fans, but with the gaze of people who had seen her true character. They carried admiration in their eyes. Silent but undeniable, Sandra stood, thanked the flight attendants politely, and waited for her turn to exit. As she stepped into the aisle, she caught Keanu's eye again. He gave her a small nod, humble and unspoken. She returned the gesture with a soft smile. Between them, no words were needed. The rude man slipped off the plane quickly, avoiding everyone's gaze. He left with the same silence that had followed him since Keanu spoke, his arrogance forgotten, his presence erased by the weight of his own actions. Sandra, however, walked off with calm dignity, her head held high. She didn't need to tell the story. It would tell itself through the people who had been there. For her, the lesson was simple yet powerful. In a world where arrogance and cruelty sometimes shouted the loudest, respect and kindness would always speak louder. And so the memory of that flight remained, not as a story of insult, but as a story of grace, friendship, and the unexpected move that silenced an entire cabin.